Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Emergency Home Learning Summit. John Hattie is our guest today. Welcome, John, and thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Steve.
So, John, tell us what you do.
Well, I'm now a retired academic from the university, and I have been working over many years being a researcher. I've also been head of school and dean of 20 odd years in different universities, including a stint at the University of North Carolina, so your home territory there, Steve. And what I've been doing my whole life as an academic is in measurement and statistics. And I had a hobby about collecting meta-analyses and trying to see why it was that every teacher and every educator and every academic I ever met could tell me what the truth was about what made the difference to kids' learning. And they were all so different. And it didn't make sense to me that we could find evidence for almost everything that every teacher does. And so that's what got me going to say, could I discriminate between not what works, but what works best, the relativities. And so that's what I did as a hobby. And I published a book 2009 on visible learning, which was quite different to all my previous work. And it kind of caught on for some reason. And that's what I do now is look at the nature of what truly makes the difference to kids' learning. And it's fun to do.
So you have a reputation for being clear thinking in an arena that's often marked by cycles of innovation or promises of reform. Can you sort of briefly describe what you see that others struggle to see?
I think there's, firstly, what I did see was that 95% of things that we do to kids enhances learning. So the question we always ask, can you enhance learning, quite frankly, is a trivial question. So what I like to think I've done is I've changed that question to saying, can we up the ante in terms of what works best? So we don't ask some relative. I think the other thing, Steve, is the very simple shift. Like, I don't care at all about how teachers teach. And I think that has been our mistake. We've been obsessed about it. We run courses on it. We run professional learning on it. Our teacher education programs are full of it, how to teach. I don't care how you teach, Steve. I care about the impact of your teaching. And making that switch, then the first thing it does is it begs the moral purpose question. What do you mean by impact? As it should. It then asks, well, what does it mean for you to have a year's growth for a year's input, which surely is minimal expectation for every teacher. And then it asks about how many kids you have an influence on, because just having it on 5 or 6 or 10 is not good enough. And then it asks, what is the magnitude of that effect? And that's been, I think, the addition to the whole conversation is about switching from how do we teach, let's talk about how you teach, let me come into your classroom and what you teach, to let me help you see your impact. Now, the other thing that does, which I actually think is very exciting, is when you work with teachers, and there are so many out there that where their kids get more than a year's growth for a year's input, you see so much excellence. And I just think it's remarkable that our education system has been based on finding failure and fixing it, as opposed to what I want to do, finding success and scaling it up. And we've just finished a book came out last week where we talk about that expertise that underlies the teaching profession. And right now, with this COVID teaching, parents are discovering that teachers have incredible expertise. Like, they're struggling with their one child and realizing that teachers have 20 to 30 to 40 of these kids every day for 200 days of the year. That is incredible expertise. But here's my worry, Steve. Why is it that we're in a profession where the profession denies its expertise? It says it's about the kids did the work. The parents did the assistance. I had the right resources. I had the right curriculum. No, I want to really bring that word expertise back into the business. And that's what I think the visible learning message is about.
You've reminded me of something in the business world called appreciative inquiry. Do you know that?
Yes.
Yeah, where you look first for what's going right and you build on that. And it has a psychological impact.
Oh, totally. And like, there's probably not a school I haven't worked in around the world where there isn't pockets of excellence. Now, what I find fascinating as an academic, if I ask the questions, how many articles have ever been written about how you scale up success in education? I'm up to 8. We look for failure. We justify and say, well, I can go in and fix that. And it's like new principals. They come into a school, they do the right thing for the first few weeks, and they look around what's happening. And then they bring out their toolbox of their solutions to the problems they see. As opposed to what we do in schools is we start by saying, let's work out across what we mean by impact, what's working well here, and let's esteem that, smell the roses, and let's work on the other parts to improve them. Now, it requires courage because it's tough. You actually have to work with teachers to, in some cases, change, in some cases, improve. Well, in fact, in all cases, improve some of the teachers. It's much easier to talk about a new intervention, a new teaching program, a new curricula. But the heart and soul of our business is those teachers. Now, the downside is, oh, well, we've got bad teachers. Well, no, I don't want to start there. And the visible learning model is this simple. Have you got the courage to reliably identify where you have excellence in your school, form a coalition around that, and upscale? And that's what we do. We work in about 10,000 schools a year around the world. And the hardest thing is building that courage.
Tell me what the phrase visible learning means.
Yeah, I get a lot of criticism because my critics say learning's not visible, you can't see it, it happens inside the head. And my argument is the opposite. Yes, it does. That's why I want to make it more visible. I want to hear kids thinking aloud. I want to hear them talking about self-explanation, self-consequences. I want to have a more understanding and switch that conversation from how we teach to how we learn. And it's not a trivial difference. I find it difficult that so many kids, when you ask them about what's a good learner, they say things like, oh, a good learner is someone who comes to class prepared, sits up straight and watches the teacher work. That's not a good learner at all. That's compliance. And I want that debate to be about what the messiness of learning. I want to talk about failure as the learner's best friend. Like, no kid should come to a class to learn that which they already know. How do you privilege not knowing? And that's not what happens to a lot of kids in classes. And so that whole notion about making learning visible, and I also want to make it learning visible from the teacher's perspective and the school leaders. And so I'm very pleased. It took me a few years actually to decide on the final title to the book. And I'm happy that I did that because it does put the focus on real water, on making that learning visible. And that mantra that I used about, I want teachers to see learning through the eyes of the students. Graham Nuttall did a piece of work many years ago where he found out that 80% of what happens in a class that a teacher doesn't see or hear. So I'm not greatly interested in teacher reflection, particularly on that 20%. I want to help them see that other 80%, and a lot of it isn't there. But that's where the learning happens, and I think we just have to be smarter about how we make learning more visible.
I've heard a phrase in the parenting world, generative parenting, and the idea is that the parenting takes place with an eye to helping the child ultimately become their own good parent of their own children, so that the parenting has to be fairly transparent. Is that a similar concept?
Yes, because my mantra is I want teachers to see learning through the eyes of the students, and I want students to become their own teachers. And ironically, Steve, my son and I have spent the last 4 years writing a book called Visible Learning for Parents, which is taking that same theme. So very generative notion. But we do make another distinction though. I don't think it's our job as educators to prepare kids for the future. They are going to prepare their future. Our job is to prepare them now. And that does mean that we do have to model and emulate the kinds of attributes and behaviors, such as great parenting, such as self-respect, such as respect for others, now in the classroom. Classrooms, particularly in our society, should be the most democratic organizations in their experience, because that's the society we want them to grow and expand. So I very much go along with that notion of generative parenting, in the same way I go along with the notions then of, if you want to call it, generative teaching. One of the fascinating things with COVID teaching, like we know that peer tutoring is quite powerful, particularly for the kid that's doing the teaching. However, some parents get a bit upset with it, saying, I didn't send my child to school to teach others or to be learned by other kids. So we've invented this new concept called Teach Back. And in fact, one school, we have Teach Back Tuesdays. And it's really good for doing the online teaching, because we say to the kids, you're going to learn this material, but on Tuesday, we're going to get you to teach it back to another kid, to a group of kids, or to your parent, or to the teacher. And it's an incredibly powerful way to hear how they're thinking about their work, how they make decisions, to look at the coat hanger underlying all the many ideas they have. And quite frankly, it's the notion of teaching. And I think every teacher in the world would agree that they learn more preparing to teach than when they walk in and sit there and have someone else teach them. So that's what we're doing now with classes and with kids in schools, and it's quite successful. And the kids really, all kids, regardless of their initial ability, really like the notion of teach back. It's a chance to shine.
Isn't there a famous Latin phrase, when man teaches, he learns? Having taken Latin for several years in school, I don't remember the phrase, but I remember that there's that is a famous phrase.
Well,
so what do you think that you've learned about learning that would be particularly useful to parents and students at this time who are struggling to understand what to do?
Well, it's interesting, Steve. Like here in the Southern Hemisphere, and I live in Australia, we went into COVID at the start of our academic year. So we've had a whole academic year. And here in Victoria, we went through the first wave. And in that first wave, the teaching was probably a little random. Teachers came up with resources, assigned it to kids, and then realized it wasn't working. They don't hover over them as they do in the regular classroom. And so there was a lot of problems in the first wave. And then Victoria here came out of the first wave, and they went back on alternate days, and some younger kids went back, etc. And then we had a second wave, and we were in 180 days of intense lockdown. Like, I was not allowed to travel with 1 kilometre from the house. We have a ring of steel around the city that you can't leave the city, and so on. And schools were closed, and we had almost 3 or 4 months of that. There was some stunningly excellent teaching. We learned very, very fast from the first lockdown what to do. We've just recently come out of the lockdown, and I think the biggest travesty of COVID is we're going to forget the excellent things that happened. Now, it's hard learning. It was tough learning. And I know in your country, you're going through, in a sense, starting the new year in a COVID situation. And I can imagine, my prediction is there is a bit of randomness going on, but I hope that there is some very, very fast learning. And certainly the research that's now coming out is showing, for example, that over the last year here in Australia, the scores and gains in reading are slightly down compared to previous years. Math scores are slightly up. Writing's down quite a lot. So when you look at the evidence of what's happened over the last sort of 8 months here in COVID, you can see the scores in reading have gone down slightly compared to previous years. And the scores in mathematics have actually gone up. Scores in writing, that's been the biggest culprit. It's gone down a lot. But then when you look at what's happened with many of the students, like some students who weren't doing so well in school have done actually better at home. They don't have the same distractions. There's a new concept that's come in for many kids in schooling, and not only do they talk about the effectiveness of their learning, they talk about the efficiency. And many of them are saying, well, I can do the work I'm assigned in about 2 hours. What do I do with the other 4 hours at school? And so that's really a good notion. The biggest losers are those kids that are most dependent on the teachers. And that's right across the achievement divide. And I think that's a really powerful message for us as teachers, that we do need to develop that whole self-regulation notion. The other difference, and it's coming out of your country, is that the amount of teacher questions per day are going down by a lot, about 60%, and the amount of teacher management goes up when you go to COVID teaching. But I think that's a symptom of a good thing, because in the regular classroom, we know, and we've actually just done a study with 17,000 teachers, we know that teachers on average talk about 90% of the time. You can't do that in COVID. And so what's the biggest difference is in COVID teaching, you have to move from talking and controlling to triage and listening to what the students are doing. Now, the most exciting part of COVID is when teachers and kids start to appreciate that students are more prepared to talk about what they don't know on social media than they do in the regular classroom. So many teachers are starting to see students through different lights. Not are they compliant, but actually how do they go about their thinking? And so you can see in the immediate beginning of the school year, I can imagine teachers are still trying to implement their old methods of talking and giving them projects to do. And it's like when we ask teachers, what do you mean by engagement? And they say, well, engagement is doing, when kids are doing things. Well, in some doing, there's not much learning. And so what teachers are realizing that just giving kids tasks to do is not as productive in online learning and from the home when the kids aren't there, because the kids get bored with just doing stuff when there's no challenge and there's no learning. So there's a lot of good stuff going on as a consequence of COVID. As soon as we can move away from our translating what we do in the regular classroom to COVID.
I'm hearing two lessons that you didn't say specifically, but maybe I'll say them and you can tell me if you agree. One is to work with the parents to work with the students to actually make the learning and the learning pathway visible, to kind of work together as a team. And the second I'm hearing is something that I've been calling the rhythm of learning, is recognizing that learning in a school building has to have a school rhythm, but learning outside of schooling doesn't. Meaning you can spend an hour or two deeply learning something and then you go play and do some other things. And that's often more productive.
Well, it is, because it's that whole interleaving and that spaced practice that we know about. But I want to add a third one to your list there, Steve, and that is during COVID, parents are more aware of the language of learning. Like, even though they all went to school themselves, schooling is not about getting things right or wrong. It's not about getting A grades all the time. It's about growth. It's about progression. And it's that struggle of learning. And it's like, if you're not struggling, then the work's too easy. Whereas many parents sometimes get upset that their kid's struggling and they want to come in and do it for them or blame the teacher because the work's too hard. And one of the things that certainly we discovered in the early days is we don't let parents access teachers over the social media. They have to do it through their kids, or they have to go through the front gate, in a sense, through the front office to talk to parents in the usual way. But we are encouraging parents to appreciate the beauty of failure, the notion of struggle, and the enjoyment when kids actually break through that. And I think that when I know here, when schools went back 2 weeks ago, on that Monday morning, if you put your ear out the window, you would have heard a collective sigh right across the city. Parents saying, it's hard. And it's true, learning is hard work. And I think that's a really good eye-opener for parents, is that of how their kid interacts with learning. And some of the kids don't interact with learning, and that's a real big struggle as well. And that's where it's been a real eye-opener for the parents. They pack them up, give them lunch, send them to school. Well, learning's hard work. And I think that's the conversations around the tea table is more about the struggles of learning. And the last thing I want any parent to ever do at the tea table is to say, what did you learn at school today? Which privileges the content, as opposed to, well, tell me about the struggles, tell me about what didn't work today, tell me about the feedback your teacher gave me. And so those discussions about learning, and I think parents end up with an incredibly higher esteem for teachers.
Are you a fan of the Carol Dweck mindset concept?
I have to answer that in my true academic form here, Steve. Yes and no. The basic idea of Carol's is unbelievably well researched, and she's one of the most esteemed academics I know, and I actually know her quite personally as a friend. And she would agree with me. I know she agrees with me because we've talked about it long and hard. The misuse of her work is frightening. She was the first to develop a program on growth versus fixed and brain thinking and all that stuff, and she killed it after 6 months, because she said the kids ran these programs, they got better, they used all the right language, they understood fixed versus growth mindset. They went back, they had a difficult maths, a difficult phys ed problem, a difficult music problem, and they said, oh, I can't do it. She didn't transfer. So she said, I killed it. And she spent a lot of time. And like, one of the things she said to me is, a growth mindset is the most fixed mindset of the lot. She said, Steve, you don't have a growth or a fixed mindset. It depends. It depends on the situation. Now, if you turn it on its head and say, what we have to do with kids is give them the confidence to take on challenges. That's exactly what a growth mindset is. And so she is disturbed, as I am, that her work has been misinterpreted and it's been sold almost as a commercial add-on to schools. And what she's doing now with her book about to come out is showing that there is a circumstances when being growth versus fixed matters. And that circumstance is when the kid doesn't know, when they're struggling, when they're confused, then saying that I can deal with this challenge as opposed to I'm dumb is incredibly powerful. So there's a right time for growth versus fixed. So yes, I am a fan of it when it's implemented right, but I'd have to say by far the majority, it's just an add-on, and it's very unfortunate that excellent work has been so abused.
As the parent of 4 children, I've also discovered that our children are different, and they are substantially different. And sometimes they need a challenge, and sometimes they need support.
Correct. That's
What
absolutely
about,
correct. And I want to, that notion of them becoming their own teacher, I want them to be more adventurous in asking for support. And this is why when people say students should be in control of their learning, well, you'll discover in COVID teaching, no, it's exactly the opposite. I want them at times to be able to say, I need an expert, I need help. And I want them to have a deeper understanding of that sense of, this is my limits. And some kids, and I'm sure you have them as I have them, they're less likely to want to take a challenge than others. And in some areas, they'll take more of a challenge, etc. And it's that, we call it the Goldilocks principle. We want them to take a challenge that's not too hard, not too easy, and not too boring. And this is the fun of learning. Some teachers think that their job is to come up with work that all the kids can do, which means they take the challenge out of learning. And that's very sad. And some students thrive on that because they don't want to be challenged. Like some of our, here's one of my questions would be back to you, Steve, is take gifted kids. Why is it the majority of gifted kids don't become gifted adults? Less than 2% of child prodigies go on to be gifted adults. And my argument is they don't know how to take on challenge. When they get to about 14 or 15 and they're forced to do subjects they haven't been doing before that maybe they're not gifted in, they fall over. They can't fail. They don't know how to take on challenge. And I think that's a travesty. So I want to bring that notion of challenge back into learning because that's the thrill.
I guess another criticism of schooling is that it infantilizes youth. And Robert Epstein did this great study on the age historically when youth became adults. And I think it was around 11 or 12. So is there a degree to which COVID provides an opportunity for parents to let their kids make decisions and become more adult-like?
Yeah, but I don't want kids to be more adult-like. I want kids to be kids. And I think there are phases that kids go through where there are enjoyments that they have that they wouldn't have if they were adults. And I think that sense of curiosity and wonder and that openness to experience is heightened in childhood. And I want to capitalize on that. And so, yeah, I want them to develop skills that they can build on as they grow. But if you've got 4 kids, you will know that transformation from 8 to 15 in that period, something happens, quite dramatic. And by thinking of them 8-year-olds as adults, we miss the obvious that at 15, they're going to be sometimes quite different to what they were at 8. And so let's look at them between 8 and 15 and love them for what they are at that stage. You know, as I said before, and if you build the platform right, they are going to create their adulthood, not us. So no, I'm very Rousseauian in that way, and that I want my kids to be kids. And I think that's my job as a parent, to do the parenting side, to do the adult side. They got plenty of time in their life when they can be adults. So no, I'm not a fan of that at all.
Understood. So it seems like a lot of the people I've interviewed have had a story in their own personal lives about schooling that then went through a transformation to another story. Did you grow up with a particular story of school and education, and did that change for you at some point?
I look back in my childhood of unbelievable naivety. I was brought up in a small rural community in a very south of the middle of the South Island of New Zealand. We didn't have TV in the country till I was 16. We didn't have a car, that kind of, and my horizons were very, very small. My father on my birth certificate was a shoemaker, a cobbler. No one told me I was from a poor side of the family. No one told me I couldn't. And I am so grateful for that. Today, if I was brought up in those same environments, there are so many ways that you're told that you're not going to succeed and your expectations are lower. And I just think that is quite stunning that I had that opportunity, that no one told me that you couldn't do these things. And I think that notion of expectations is not only powerful, but sometimes it's quite damning. Like we know that teachers who have low expectations tend to have it for all the students, and unfortunately they're very successful at keeping that growth very low. And I went through a school where the majority of the teachers were ex-soldiers after the Second World War in the 1950s. But then I had some teachers, and it's kind of interesting. A couple of years ago, we actually got some data. We're looking at adults talking about the best teachers they ever had, and there were two themes came through. One was the teachers who turned you onto their passion, and/or the teachers who saw something in you didn't see in yourself. And I was lucky. I had a few of those teachers who saw something in me I didn't see in myself. Like my final year maths teacher at high school. And those days we had to do maths whether we liked it or not. And I was okay in it, but I probably would have dropped it if I was allowed to today. But he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself and turned me on to mathematics. So my PhD is in statistics. And so that's when I look at teachers. No one of the 600 teachers that we used in our studies ever talked about, because it was maths or music or English. It was because of that attribute of the teacher. I think it's a really powerful message for parents. It's about your expectations for your children and you seeing something in them they don't see in themselves. And it's like the worst thing you could ever do as a parent or a school is say, I'm going to help the child reach their potential. Ouch. Their concept of their potential may not be good enough. And so opening up your children to new possibilities, to new challenges, to new horizons, I think it's a really important part of school and a part of parenting. Get them to do things that they probably wouldn't think of doing themselves. This is why we're parents and our children. And so I think that's ours. And it's like when my kids were living in North Carolina, as you know, the opportunities to diversify and to do things you've never done before. In my job, I had to go up to Washington, D.C. once a month for about 4 years. We were probably naughty parents. We took our kids out of school on the Friday, went up there, and we had a rule. Every time we go up, you have to go to somewhere new. Now, they always wanted to go back to space and air museum, and we discovered unbelievable things in the Washington area for that simple rule. Each time parents were allowed to choose something new, they had to choose something new. And this is what I want parents to do. Create those different opportunities. Now, for some parents, I know it's hard. That's why we have schools.
John, thank you.
Pleasure talking to you.